The ice chamber doors sealed with a mechanical hiss, trapping her inside with temperatures that would drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit within minutes. Through the frosted observation window, 3 researchers watched with clipboard calculations and stopwatch precision, expecting to document another failed attempt at their experimental cold resistance protocol. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Marcus Webb adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and nodded to his assistant. Begin thermal descent. Standard increments. The machinery hummed to life, pumping refrigerated air into the sealed chamber where a lone woman sat cross-legged on the metal floor, wearing nothing but standard-issue thermal underwear and a heart rate monitor. Sarah Chen had volunteered for the trial 30 minutes earlier, signing waivers that most participants spent hours reviewing. She'd read through the documentation in less than 10 minutes, asked 3 technical questions about emergency protocols, then stripped down to the required garments without hesitation. No nervous jokes, no requests for additional time to prepare mentally, no demands for extra blankets or comfort items that other volunteers typically negotiated for. The Anchorage Research Institute's Extreme Environment Laboratory had been conducting cold resistance studies for 18 months, testing human physiological responses to Arctic conditions that military personnel and emergency responders might encounter. Most volunteers lasted between 8 and 12 minutes before requesting immediate extraction. The current record holder, a former Navy SEAL, had endured 17 minutes before his core temperature dropped to dangerous levels. Webb expected Sarah to follow the typical pattern. Initial confidence, gradual discomfort, increasing distress, then urgent evacuation requests as hypothermia symptoms began manifesting. His research protocols were built around documenting these predictable human responses to extreme cold exposure. Temperature now at -15 and dropping, announced Dr. Patricia Morse, monitoring the environmental controls. Heart rate is steady at 68 beats per minute. She glanced at Webb with surprise. Most subjects showed elevated heart rates within the first 3 minutes as stress responses kicked in. Sarah remained motionless in the center of the chamber, her breathing slow and controlled. Her posture hadn't shifted since the door closed. She sat with perfect spinal alignment, hands resting loosely on her knees, eyes closed in what appeared to be meditation. The heart rate monitor showed none of the spikes or irregularities that typically accompanied fear or discomfort. -25 degrees, Morse reported. Still no physiological distress indicators. Webb frowned at his clipboard. At this temperature, previous subjects had begun shivering uncontrollably, complaining of numbness in extremities, requesting additional layers or early termination. Sarah's vitals remained as steady as if she were sitting in a comfortable room reading a book. The third researcher, Dr. James Mitchell, leaned closer to the observation window. Look at her skin tone. No visible signs of vasoconstriction. Most people start showing pale coloring in their hands and face by now. Sarah's complexion remained normal. No blue-tinged lips or fingernails that usually indicated the body's attempts to preserve core temperature by restricting blood flow to extremities. Her breathing produced no visible vapor clouds despite the sub-freezing air temperature. -30 degrees, Morse announced. This is unprecedented. Webb set down his clipboard and stepped closer to the monitoring equipment. Sarah's heart rate had actually decreased to 64 beats per minute. Her respiratory rate remained at 12 breaths per minute, the same relaxed pattern she'd maintained since entering the chamber. Core body temperature held steady at 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Run diagnostics on the monitoring equipment, Webb instructed. These readings can't be accurate. Mitchell ran through the system checks while keeping his eyes fixed on Sarah through the observation window. All equipment is functioning normally. Calibrated this morning. The readings are accurate. Inside the chamber, Sarah opened her eyes for the first time since the trial began. She looked directly at the observation window, not with the desperate plea for rescue that researchers typically encountered at this stage, but with calm acknowledgement of their presence. She raised one hand in a small wave, then closed her eyes and returned to her meditative posture. Jesus, Mitchell whispered. She's treating this like a routine exercise. Quote, Webb had conducted these experiments with 237 volunteers over the past year and a half. He'd seen military personnel, professional athletes, survival instructors, and wilderness guides. None had demonstrated this level of physiological adaptation to extreme cold. None had remained this composed, under conditions that triggered primal survival instincts in every other human being he'd tested. -35 degrees, Morse reported, her voice tight with disbelief. We're approaching the lower threshold of our testing parameters. The chamber had reached temperatures that caused frostbite in exposed skin within minutes. At this level, previous subjects had been extracted unconscious or in severe hypothermic shock. Sarah continued sitting peacefully, occasionally shifting her weight slightly but showing no signs of distress, discomfort, or survival desperation. Webb activated the intercom system. "Sarah, can you hear me? How are you feeling?" Her response came through the speakers clear and steady, no chattering teeth or breathless speech patterns. "I'm fine, Dr. Webb. Continue with your protocol." "Are you experiencing any numbness, tingling, or discomfort in your hands or feet?" "No." "Any difficulty breathing or chest tightness?" "No." "Dizziness, confusion, or disorientation?" "No." Mitchell checked the environmental controls again. "Chamber temperature now at -38 degrees. We're beyond our usual testing range." Webb studied Sarah through the observation window, trying to understand what he was witnessing. Her thermal underwear should have provided minimal insulation against these conditions. Her exposed skin should have shown clear signs of cold injury. Her body should have been fighting desperately to maintain core temperature through violent shivering, increased heart rate, and elevated breathing patterns. Instead, she appeared as comfortable as someone sitting in an air-conditioned office during summer. "Dr. Webb," Morse said quietly, "I think we need to consider that this volunteer might have some kind of medical condition that affects her cold sensitivity. Hypothyroidism, neuropathy, or medication effects that could mask normal physiological responses." We screened her medical history. Clean bill of health, no medications, no conditions that would affect thermoregulation. Webb activated the intercom again. "Sarah, we're going to begin bringing the temperature back up. This trial has exceeded our normal parameters. If your equipment can get colder, I'm willing to continue." The three researchers exchanged glances. No volunteer had ever requested to extend exposure time, especially not at temperatures that were approaching the limits of their safety protocols. "Our liability parameters don't allow for further temperature reduction," Webb replied. "We're going to start warming the chamber now." "Understood." As the environmental systems began reversing the cooling process, Webb reviewed Sarah's intake paperwork. Age 32, occupation listed as, quote, "freelance consultant, previous address in Seattle, emergency contact listed as her sister in Portland, medical clearance from a physician in Washington State, all standard documentation that revealed nothing unusual about her background or qualifications. But her performance in the chamber suggested training or experience that went far beyond anything documented in her volunteer application. Temperature rising, Morse reported. -30, -25, -20. Sarah remained in the same meditative position, showing no visible relief or reaction to the warming air. Most subjects who survived extreme cold exposure demonstrated immediate physiological responses when conditions improved. Visible relaxation, deeper breathing, color returning to skin, verbal expressions of relief or gratitude. Sarah continued sitting peacefully, as if the temperature change was irrelevant to her comfort level. -10 degrees, Morse announced. Approaching normal extraction temperature. Webb prepared the post-trial medical evaluation checklist. Standard protocol required immediate assessment for hypothermia symptoms, frostbite indicators, and psychological stress responses. Based on Sarah's performance, he expected to find nothing abnormal, which itself was abnormal. When the chamber reached 0 degrees Fahrenheit, Webb opened the observation room door and stepped into the preparation area. Through the intercom, he announced, "Sarah, we're going to open the chamber now. Please remain seated until we can conduct your post-trial evaluation." The chamber door unlocked with a mechanical click. Sarah stood up smoothly. No stiffness or difficulty with movement that typically followed prolonged exposure to extreme cold. She walked to the door with steady steps. No stumbling or coordination problems that often affected volunteers after hypothermic stress. Webb met her at the chamber entrance with a thermal blanket and hot beverage, Standard comfort measures for all trial participants. Sarah accepted the blanket with a polite smile, but didn't wrap it around herself with the desperate urgency that characterized most post-trial behavior. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "How do you feel?" Webb asked, beginning his medical assessment. "Fine. A little thirsty, but fine." Mitchell and Morse joined them in the preparation area, both studying Sarah with the kind of intense curiosity that significant anomalies generated in research environments. They'd just witnessed a human performance that contradicted everything they understood about physiological responses to extreme cold. "Sarah," Webb said carefully, "your performance in this trial was highly unusual. Most people can't tolerate those conditions for more than a few minutes. You showed no signs of hypothermic stress after nearly 20 minutes of exposure to temperatures that cause severe injury in unprotected individuals." "I have good cold tolerance." "This goes beyond good cold tolerance. This suggests specialized training or previous exposure to extreme environments. Can you tell us about your background?" Sarah accepted the hot coffee, but didn't drink it immediately, holding the cup without the desperate need for warmth that other volunteers typically demonstrated. "I've spent time in cold climates." "What kind of time? Professional, military, research?" "Various situations." Webb recognized evasiveness when he heard it, but he also recognized that volunteers weren't required to provide detailed personal histories beyond medical clearance. Still, Sarah's performance demanded some kind of explanation, both for his research documentation and for the safety protocols that govern their experimental procedures. "The reason I'm asking is that your physiological responses were unlike anything we've documented. If you have specialized training that helps you tolerate these conditions, it could be valuable information for our research." Sarah handed back the thermal blanket. "Dr. Webb, I signed up for your trial, completed it according to your protocols, and I'm medically fine. That should be sufficient for your research purposes." Mitchell stepped forward. "Ma'am, with respect, what we just observed challenges our understanding of human cold tolerance. If there are techniques or training methods that enable your performance, sharing that information could help save lives in emergency situations." "I understand your scientific curiosity, but I'm not comfortable discussing my personal background in detail." Webb nodded, recognizing that pushing further might violate ethical research guidelines. Volunteers had rights to privacy that superseded research interests, but he made a mental note to review Sarah's application more carefully and to document this trial as a significant outlier requiring further investigation. "We'll need you to remain here for 30 minutes of post-trial observation," Webb explained, "standard safety protocol to ensure no delayed reactions to cold exposure." "Of course." As Sarah settled into a chair in the observation area, Webb pulled Mitchell and Morse aside for a private consultation. The three researchers spoke in low voices about what they'd witnessed, trying to reconcile their observations with known human physiology. "Either our equipment malfunctioned, which diagnostics say it didn't," Mitchell whispered, "or we just tested someone with cold resistance capabilities that shouldn't exist in normal human beings." Morse nodded towards Sarah, who was calmly reading a magazine from the waiting area table. "Look at her. No shivering, no residual stress responses, no seeking additional warmth. It's like the cold exposure never happened." Webb glanced at his research notes, knowing that this trial would require special documentation and possibly review by his department supervisors. Sarah Chen had just demonstrated human performance that fell outside every parameter his laboratory had established for cold tolerance research. And something in her calm demeanor, her practiced evasiveness about her background, and her complete lack of surprise at her own performance suggested that she had expected exactly this outcome from the beginning. 3 days after the unprecedented cold tolerance trial, Sarah Chen arrived at the Anchorage Research Institute for her scheduled follow-up interview. She drove a modest Honda Civic with Alaska plates and Washington state registration stickers, parking in the visitor section with the same unhurried precision she'd demonstrated during the experiment. Dr. Webb watched from his office window as she walked across the parking lot. Her movement patterns caught his attention immediately. She navigated patches of ice and snow with absolute confidence, never checking her footing or adjusting her stride for slippery conditions. Her jacket was unzipped despite the 20-degree morning temperature, and she wore lightweight hiking boots instead of the heavy winter gear that most people required for Alaska's climate. The Institute's lobby featured a large aquarium filled with Arctic char, their movements sluggish in water maintained at just above freezing to simulate their natural habitat. Sarah paused to observe the fish, her expression showing genuine interest rather than casual curiosity. She studied their behavioral patterns, the way they conserved energy through minimal movement, their adaptation to extreme cold environments. Receptionist Jennifer Walsh had worked at the Institute for 4 years and had seen hundreds of research volunteers. Most people entering the building for the first time showed signs of nervousness or curiosity about the scientific equipment visible through glass partitions. They asked questions about the research, requested directions to restrooms, or inquired about the duration of their appointments. Sarah simply approached the reception desk and announced, "Sarah Chen for Dr. Webb." "He'll be right with you. Can I get you coffee or water while you wait?" "Water would be fine." Jennifer retrieved a bottle from the small refrigerator behind her desk. Sarah accepted it and took a seat in the waiting area, opening a book she'd brought with her. Jennifer glanced at the title, Physiological Adaptations in Extreme Environments, by Dr. Raymond Kaczynski, a technical text that most volunteers wouldn't have chosen for casual reading. Dr. Webb emerged from his office 15 minutes later to find Sarah completely absorbed in her book, making marginal notes with a pencil. She looked up when he approached, marked her place with a bookmark, and stood to shake his hand. "Thank you for coming back for the follow-up interview," Webb said. "I hope the drive from your hotel wasn't too difficult." "I'm staying at a cabin about 30 miles north of here. No problems with the drive." Webb paused. 30 miles north placed her in a wilderness area where most rental properties were summer fishing lodges that closed during winter months. "Are you familiar with this area?" "I've spent time in Alaska before." As they walked toward his office, Webb noticed that Sarah moved through the building like someone familiar with institutional layouts. She didn't hesitate at corridor intersections or look around for directional signs. When they passed the laboratory where her cold tolerance trial had been conducted, she glanced through the observation window with professional interest, not the curiosity of someone seeing the equipment for the first time. Webb's office walls displayed his credentials from Stanford University, research photographs from Antarctic expeditions, and temperature monitoring equipment from various field studies. Sarah examined the Antarctic photos with particular attention, studying the landscape features and expedition gear visible in the images. "Have you worked in polar environments?" she asked. "2 research expeditions to Antarctica, 1 to northern Greenland. The work focuses on how extreme cold affects human performance and decision-making capabilities." Webb settled behind his desk. "What about you? Your performance in our trial suggested a significant cold weather experience." "I've traveled to cold places." Webb opened Sarah's file, reviewing the intake information she'd provided 3 days earlier. Emergency contact listed as Rebecca Chen in Portland, Oregon. Previous address in Seattle, Washington. Occupation described as freelance consultant, with no specific industry or specialization noted. "Can you tell me more about your consulting work?" "I help organizations solve problems that require specialized knowledge." "What kind of specialized knowledge?" "It depends on the situation." Webb recognized the same evasiveness he'd encountered during their previous conversation, but he also noticed something else. Sarah answered his questions directly without appearing defensive or uncomfortable. Her responses weren't evasive in the sense of someone hiding embarrassing information. They carried the careful precision of someone accustomed to discussing their work in general terms without revealing specific details. "Sarah, your performance in our cold tolerance trial was extraordinary. In 18 months of research, we've never documented physiological responses like yours. If you have training or experience that contributed to those results, it could help us develop better preparation protocols for people who work in extreme environments." Sarah considered this for a moment before responding. "Dr. Webb, I appreciate your research objectives, but I'm not comfortable providing detailed information about my background. I volunteered for your trial, completed it successfully, and I'm willing to participate in follow-up studies if they would be helpful. Beyond that, I'd prefer to keep my personal history private." Webb nodded, understanding that pushing further might violate research ethics guidelines, but he made notes about her responses, her demeanor, and the way she carried herself during their conversation. Everything about Sarah Chen suggested capabilities and experience that extended far beyond what most civilians would possess. "Would you be willing to participate in additional trials? We have protocols for testing cold weather gear, measuring caloric requirements during cold exposure, and evaluating cognitive function under hypothermic stress. What would those trials involve? Webb explained the Institute's broader research program. They worked with military personnel, emergency responders, and civilian organizations that operated in extreme weather conditions. Their studies provided data for developing better protective equipment, training protocols, and safety procedures. The gear testing involves wearing experimental clothing systems during controlled cold exposure. We measure thermal efficiency, mobility, and comfort factors. The caloric studies track metabolic changes during temperature stress. The cognitive tests evaluate how extreme cold affects decision-making, reaction time, and problem-solving abilities. How long would each trial take? Gear testing typically runs 2 to 3 hours. Caloric studies require full-day participation with meal planning and metabolic monitoring. Cognitive testing involves 4 to 6 hours of mental performance evaluations during progressive cold exposure. Sarah appeared genuinely interested in the research applications. Would the data be used to improve safety equipment for people working in harsh conditions? Absolutely. Our findings influence equipment design, training programs, and operational procedures for organizations whose personnel face extreme weather risks. I'd be willing to participate in those studies. Webb scheduled Sarah for 3 additional trials over the following 2 weeks. Impressed by her commitment to contributing to research that could help protect other people, most volunteers participated once for the monetary compensation, rarely returning for multiple trials that involved increasing levels of discomfort and risk. After Sarah left his office, Webb called Dr. Morse and Dr. Mitchell for a consultation about their unusual volunteer work. The 3 researchers met in the laboratory conference room to discuss their observations and plan their approach for the upcoming trials. "I've reviewed the video footage from her cold tolerance trial," Mitchell reported. Frame-by-frame analysis shows no visible stress responses throughout the entire 20-minute exposure. No involuntary shivering, no changes in facial expression, no defensive body positioning. She maintained the same relaxed posture from beginning to end. Morse pulled up Sarah's physiological data on the conference room monitor. Heart rate variability analysis shows patterns consistent with deep meditation or trained relaxation techniques. Her breathing never deviated from optimal efficiency ratios. Core temperature regulation remained within normal ranges, despite environmental conditions that should have triggered hypothermic responses. Webb studied the data displays, trying to reconcile the measurements with known human physiology. Either we're dealing with someone who has exceptional natural cold tolerance, or we're looking at training and conditioning that goes beyond anything documented in civilian populations. There's a third possibility, Mitchell said quietly. Previous exposure to extreme conditions that resulted in physiological adaptations. The 3 researchers considered this implication. Adaptation to extreme cold typically required prolonged exposure over months or years, the kind of conditioning that occurred in people who lived and worked in harsh environments as a matter of survival rather than choice. Her intake paperwork lists previous residents in Seattle, Morse noted. That's a temperate climate, not conditions that would produce the kind of cold adaptation we observed. But she mentioned traveling to cold places, Webb replied. And she's staying at a cabin 30 miles north of here, in an area where most properties are closed during winter months. Mitchell accessed the Institute's database of research participants, searching for volunteers with similar performance profiles. In 18 months, we've tested military personnel from cold weather training programs, professional mountaineers, Arctic researchers, and survival instructors. None showed the physiological responses that Sarah demonstrated. Webb made a decision that would influence their research protocols for the upcoming trials. For the gear testing and cognitive evaluation studies, I want continuous monitoring of her physiological responses. Heart rate, respiration, core temperature, skin temperature at multiple points, brain activity if she'll consent to EEG monitoring. You think we'll learn something new? Morse asked. I think Sarah Chen has capabilities that could revolutionize our understanding of human adaptation to extreme environments. If we can document her responses across multiple trial types, we might identify training techniques or conditioning methods that could help other people develop similar cold tolerance. The researchers spent the remainder of their meeting planning experimental protocols that would capture comprehensive data about Sarah's unique abilities. They designed trials that would test not just her physical responses to cold, but her cognitive function, decision-making capabilities, and psychological resilience under conditions that challenged most people's survival instincts. Webb also made a note to conduct more thorough background research on Sarah Chen. Her performance suggested experience and training that weren't reflected in her volunteer application. Understanding her background might provide insights into how ordinary people could develop extraordinary cold weather capabilities. That evening, Webb drove home through Anchorage's residential areas, passing houses where people had their heating systems running at maximum capacity to combat the winter temperatures. He thought about Sarah Chen, staying alone in a wilderness cabin without apparent concern for the isolation or harsh conditions that would make most people uncomfortable. His research had always focused on helping people survive in extreme environments. Sarah appeared to have already solved that problem in ways that his scientific training couldn't fully explain. The upcoming trials would either provide answers about her remarkable abilities, or raise even more questions about what humans could accomplish when properly prepared for the world's harshest conditions. Webb's phone buzzed with a text message from his research assistant. She had found additional information about the cabin where Sarah was staying, information that would add another layer of complexity to their understanding of their extraordinary volunteer. The gear testing trial was scheduled for Thursday morning, but Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected complication that would transform routine research into something far more dangerous. Dr. Ryan Blackwood arrived at the Anchorage Research Institute with authorization papers from the Department of Defense and an attitude that immediately set everyone on edge. Blackwood represented the Military Environmental Research Division, a department that funded portions of the Institute's work through grants and contracts. He was tall, sharp-featured, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of confidence that came from having authority over other people's careers and budgets. "Dr. Webb," Blackwood announced as he entered the laboratory without knocking, "I'm here to observe your cold tolerance research, specifically the anomalous results from your recent trial." Webb looked up from his equipment calibration, surprised by the unscheduled visit. "Mr. Blackwood, we weren't expecting a review until next month. The quarterly reports aren't due until—" "This isn't about quarterly reports. We received notification about a volunteer who demonstrated unprecedented cold resistance. I want to observe her next trial personally." Dr. Morse, who had been preparing monitoring equipment for Thursday's gear testing, paused in her work. "How did you receive notification? Our trial results aren't distributed outside the Institute until they've been peer-reviewed." Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. "The Department of Defense maintains oversight of all research conducted with our funding. Exceptional results trigger automatic review protocols." Webb felt uncomfortable with this explanation, but Blackwood had legitimate authority over their research program. Military funding came with requirements for transparency and compliance that civilian researchers had to accept as conditions of their grants. "What specifically do you want to observe?" "I want to see this volunteer's capabilities tested under more demanding conditions than your standard protocols allow. We need to understand the full extent of her cold tolerance and determine whether her abilities have potential military applications." Mitchell joined the conversation from across the laboratory. "Our safety protocols limit exposure duration and temperature ranges based on ethical research guidelines. We can't exceed those parameters without additional approvals and medical oversight." "I have authorization to modify your protocols for this evaluation," Blackwood replied, producing a folder of official documents. "Enhanced testing parameters, extended exposure duration, and broader environmental variables." Webb reviewed the authorization papers, noting signatures from departments he didn't recognize and clearance levels that seemed excessive for routine research oversight. The modifications Blackwood was requesting would push their testing beyond anything they'd previously attempted. "These parameters would expose volunteers to conditions that could cause serious injury or death," Webb protested. "We can't ethically subject research participants to that level of risk. This volunteer has already demonstrated exceptional tolerance. These enhanced protocols are designed to establish the upper limits of her capabilities in a controlled environment." Morse stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 15 years conducting ethical research. "Mr. Blackwood, regardless of authorization levels, we have professional obligations to protect volunteer safety. What you're proposing violates every standard we follow." Blackwood's response revealed the true nature of his interest in Sarah Chen. Dr. Morse, the volunteer in question, isn't just demonstrating unusual cold tolerance. Her physiological responses suggest training or conditioning that could have significant national security implications. We need to understand what we're dealing with. The laboratory fell silent as the researchers absorbed this statement. Blackwood wasn't interested in Sarah's abilities for scientific purposes. He suspected she represented some kind of security concern that required investigation through extreme testing protocols. What kind of national security implications? Webb asked carefully. Individuals with her level of environmental adaptation typically acquire those capabilities through specialized military training, intelligence operations, or exposure to classified programs. Her background needs to be verified, and her abilities need to be fully documented. Mitchell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the laboratory's temperature controls. Are you saying you think she's some kind of spy or foreign agent? I'm saying we need to determine who trained her, where she acquired her capabilities, and whether her presence here represents a security risk to our research programs. Webb realized that their routine research trial had attracted attention from departments that operated under different rules than academic institutions. Sarah's exceptional performance had triggered security reviews that could put her in serious danger. Mr. Blackwood, even if your concerns are legitimate, we can't subject a volunteer to dangerous testing without her informed consent. She would need to understand the risks and agree to participate willingly. She'll consent. People with her background understand the importance of demonstrating loyalty and cooperation when questioned by authorized personnel. The implication hung in the air like a threat. Blackwood expected Sarah to submit to dangerous testing not as a voluntary research participant, but as someone who might face consequences for refusing to cooperate with a security investigation. Morse made a decision that would escalate the confrontation beyond simple disagreement about research protocols. I'm calling Dr. Amanda Foster at the University Review Board. This situation requires ethical oversight before we proceed. Blackwood's response was immediate and aggressive. Dr. Morse, you will not contact outside reviewers without clearance from my department. This matter involves classified security concerns that can't be discussed with unauthorized personnel. Our research isn't classified. Our volunteers have rights that can't be overridden by security investigations. Your volunteer's background may be classified, which changes the legal framework governing her participation in this research. Webb felt the situation spinning beyond his control. What had begun as scientific curiosity about Sarah's remarkable cold tolerance was becoming a confrontation between research ethics and national security protocols that he wasn't qualified to navigate. Thursday morning arrived with tensions running high throughout the institute. Sarah appeared for her scheduled gear testing trial, unaware that her participation had attracted interest from departments that operated under rules she might not be prepared to handle. She entered the preparation area wearing the same unhurried demeanor she'd maintained during her previous visit, greeting the research team with polite professionalism. But Webb noticed that she seemed more alert than before, her eyes scanning the laboratory with the kind of careful attention that suggested awareness of changed circumstances. Dr. Webb, she said, I noticed additional vehicles in the parking area. Are there other researchers observing today's trial? Before Webb could respond, Blackwood emerged from the observation room where he'd been reviewing equipment setups. Sarah's reaction to his appearance was subtle but immediate. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, weight distribution changing in a way that suggested readiness for sudden movement. Ms. Chen, Blackwood said, I'm Ryan Blackwood from the Military Environmental Research Division. I'm here to observe your participation in today's trial. Sarah studied Blackwood with the kind of careful assessment that people used when evaluating potential threats. What kind of observations are you conducting? We're interested in understanding the full extent of your cold weather capabilities. Today's trial will involve more comprehensive testing than your previous session. Webb intervened before Blackwood could explain the enhanced protocols. Sarah, we need to discuss some modifications to today's testing procedures. There are additional parameters that weren't part of your original consent. She looked at Webb, then back at Blackwood, clearly recognizing that something had changed since her last visit. What kind of modifications? Blackwood stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his requirements met without question. Extended exposure duration, lower temperature ranges, and additional physiological monitoring. We need to establish the upper limits of your cold tolerance. For what purpose? To determine whether your capabilities have applications for personnel who work in extreme environments. Sarah's response revealed that she understood exactly what Blackwood was really asking. Mr. Blackwood, I volunteer to participate in Dr. Webb's research because it might help improve safety equipment and training for people who face cold weather risks. I didn't volunteer to be tested for military applications. Your performance in the initial trial suggests training or experience that goes beyond civilian preparation. We need to understand where you acquired those capabilities. The confrontation had begun in earnest. Sarah faced a choice between submitting to dangerous testing procedures or refusing to cooperate with someone who had authority to make her life extremely difficult. Webb watched this exchange with growing concern, realizing that his research had inadvertently exposed Sarah to scrutiny from departments that operated under different ethical standards than academic institutions. Whatever her background, she deserved protection from testing that could harm her. Mr. Blackwood, Webb said, if you want to modify our research protocols, you'll need to go through proper approval channels. I can't subject volunteers to procedures that exceed our safety parameters. Quote. Blackwood's response made clear that he considered this a national security matter rather than routine research. Dr. Webb, your volunteers' capabilities suggest possible exposure to classified training programs. Determining the source of that training is a matter of national interest that takes precedence over your institutional protocols. Sarah spoke quietly, but her words carried unmistakable authority. Mr. Blackwood, I haven't agreed to participate in any testing beyond Dr. Webb's original research parameters. If you want something different, you'll need to provide legal justification for your requirements. The laboratory atmosphere grew tense as Blackwood realized that Sarah wasn't going to cooperate voluntarily with his enhanced testing protocols. His next move would determine whether this remained a discussion between professionals or escalated into something that could put everyone in the room in danger. Ms. Chen, Blackwood said, his tone shifting to something that sounded like barely controlled threat. People with your level of cold weather adaptation typically acquire those skills through exposure to programs that fall under national security oversight. If you acquired classified training, you have legal obligations to cooperate with security reviews. Sarah's response was calm, measured, and completely unintimidated. Mr. Blackwood, unless you have specific legal authority to compel my participation, I'm declining to undergo your enhanced testing procedures. The confrontation had reached a point where someone would have to back down or escalate to methods that could put Sarah in serious jeopardy. Webb realized that his volunteer was facing pressure from departments that might not respect the ethical limitations that governed legitimate research. What happened next would determine whether Sarah's remarkable abilities remained a scientific curiosity or became the focus of an investigation that could reveal secrets some people might kill to protect. The standoff in the laboratory stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Blackwood made his move. He pulled out his phone and made a call to someone whose authority apparently superseded institutional protocols and ethical research guidelines. This is Blackwood at the Anchorage facility. I need immediate authorization for enhanced interrogation protocols on a potential security risk. He listened for a moment, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Confirmed. Subject is demonstrating capabilities consistent with classified training programs and is refusing to cooperate with standard verification procedures. Dr. Webb felt his stomach tighten as he realized that Sarah's situation had moved beyond research oversight into territory that could become dangerous very quickly. Mr. Blackwood, this is still an academic research facility. You can't conduct interrogations here without proper legal authority. Dr. Webb, when potential security threats are identified at facilities receiving federal funding, different rules apply. Blackwood ended his phone call and addressed Sarah directly. Ms. Chen, I have authorization to detain you for questioning until we can verify your background and the source of your capabilities. Sarah's response surprised everyone in the room. Instead of showing fear or attempting to negotiate, she simply nodded and said, I understand. What do you need me to do? Her calm acceptance seemed to catch Blackwood off guard. He'd apparently expected resistance, argument, or at least signs of nervousness from someone facing detention and interrogation. Sarah displayed none of those reactions. I need you to submit to the enhanced testing protocols so we can document your full capabilities. Then we'll conduct a detailed interview about your background, training, and current activities. The enhanced protocols that Dr. Webb says could cause serious injury. The protocols necessary to determine whether you represent a national security concern. Sarah considered this for a moment, then asked a question that made everyone in the room reconsider what they thought they knew about her. Mr. Blackwood, before we proceed, I need to make a phone call. You're not in a position to make demands about communication privileges. It's not a demand. It's a notification that you might want me to make. Something in her tone caused Blackwood to pause. Sarah wasn't speaking like someone who felt trapped or desperate. She sounded like someone who was trying to prevent him from making a serious mistake. What kind of notification? The kind that might save you from conducting an investigation that could compromise operations you don't have clearance to know about. The laboratory went completely silent. Sarah's words implied that she wasn't just someone with unusual cold tolerance who had attracted unwanted attention. She was suggesting that investigating her could expose classified activities that were beyond Blackwood's authorization level. Dr. Mitchell found his voice first. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" She ignored his question and focused on Blackwood. "I'm going to give you a phone number. When you call it, identify yourself and explain that you're investigating someone named Sarah Chen at the Anchorage Research Institute. Then listen very carefully to what they tell you." Blackwood's confidence wavered slightly, but he maintained his authoritative posture. "I'm not taking orders from someone I'm investigating." "You're not taking orders. You're receiving advice that could prevent you from interfering with activities that are classified well above your clearance level." Sarah reached into her jacket pocket slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might be interpreted as threatening. She withdrew a small notebook, wrote down a phone number, and handed the paper to Blackwood. "Call that number. Ask for verification on designation Arctic Wolf 7. The effect of those words on Blackwood was immediate and dramatic. His face went pale, and his hands actually trembled slightly as he took the paper from Sarah. Arctic Wolf was a code designation that he recognized, even though he didn't have clearance to know the details of operations that used that classification. Dr. Webb watched this exchange with growing confusion. Sarah had just referenced what sounded like a military operation, using terminology that caused a dramatic change in Blackwood's demeanor. Whatever Arctic Wolf 7 meant, it carried enough authority to make someone with Blackwood's confidence suddenly uncertain about his course of action. "Dr. Webb," Sarah said quietly, "I think it would be better if you and your team waited in another room while Mr. Blackwood made his phone call." Webb started to protest, but something in Sarah's expression convinced him that complying with her suggestion was the safest course of action for everyone involved. He gestured for Mitchell and Morse to follow him to the adjacent preparation room, leaving Sarah and Blackwood alone in the laboratory. Through the glass partition, the researchers could see Blackwood making his phone call, but they couldn't hear the conversation. What they could observe was his body language, which shifted from aggressive authority to increasing nervousness as the call progressed. "What do you think is happening there?" Mitchell whispered. "I think we're about to learn that Sarah Chen isn't just someone with good cold tolerance," Webb replied. The phone call lasted nearly 10 minutes. When it ended, Blackwood's entire demeanor had changed. He looked at Sarah with what appeared to be a mixture of respect and apprehension, then walked to the partition and gestured for the research team to return to the laboratory. "Dr. Webb," Blackwood said, his voice lacking the commanding authority he'd displayed earlier, "I need to speak with you privately." They stepped into Webb's office, where Blackwood delivered information that would completely transform their understanding of Sarah Chen and her presence at their research facility. Arctic Wolf 7 is a designation for deep-cover operatives who were deployed on long-term missions in environments so classified that even people with top-secret clearances aren't supposed to know they exist. Blackwood paused, clearly struggling with how much he could reveal. "The woman you know as Sarah Chen spent 3 years working alone in conditions that would kill most people within hours." Webb felt his understanding of the past week's events shifting dramatically. What kind of conditions? Arctic operations in regions where the temperature never rises above -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Solo missions lasting months at a time, maintaining equipment and conducting observations in places where rescue would be impossible if anything went wrong. Why was she doing that kind of work? Blackwood hesitated, clearly operating at the edge of what he was authorized to discuss. "There are facilities in the Arctic that monitor activities we need to understand but can't acknowledge officially. Someone has to maintain the equipment that keeps us informed about things that could affect national security." The implications hit Webb like a physical blow. Sarah Chen had spent years living and working in conditions far more extreme than anything his research laboratory could simulate. Her performance in their cold tolerance trial wasn't exceptional for someone with her background. It was probably mild compared to what she'd endured during her operational assignments. "The person who answered when I called that number made it very clear that Sarah Chen's cover identity is protected at the highest levels of government," Blackwood continued. Investigating her background or revealing her presence here could compromise ongoing operations that are vital to national security. Webb realized that his research facility had inadvertently become involved in intelligence operations that were far beyond anything they were qualified to handle. What does this mean for our research program? It means that Ms. Chen's participation in your trials is now classified information. You cannot discuss her performance, document her capabilities, or reference her involvement in any reports or publications. And what about Sarah herself? She continues with her cover identity. As far as anyone outside this room is concerned, she's a freelance consultant who volunteered for cold tolerance research. Nothing more. When they returned to the laboratory, Sarah was sitting quietly in the same chair she'd occupied throughout the confrontation, showing no signs of stress or concern about the investigation that had just been terminated through a single phone call. "Ms. Chen," Blackwood said, his tone now completely respectful, "I apologize for the inconvenience. There was a misunderstanding about your background that has been clarified through proper channels." "No problem, Mr. Blackwood. These things happen. Will you still be participating in Dr. Webb's research trials?" Sarah looked at Webb with what might have been amusement. "If Dr. Webb still wants my participation, I'm happy to continue with the original research protocols." Webb found himself in the surreal position of offering research participation to someone whose real job involved surviving in conditions that made his laboratory experiments look like recreational activities. "Of course. We'd be honored to have your continued participation." After Blackwood left the facility with stern warnings about maintaining security protocols, the research team found themselves alone with someone they now knew was far more than she appeared to be. "Sarah," Dr. Morse said carefully, "can you tell us anything about your real background?" "My background is exactly what I told you. I'm a freelance consultant who helps organizations solve problems that require specialized knowledge. But the Arctic Wolf designation is part of work that I can't discuss, just like you probably can't discuss all the details of your research with people who don't have appropriate clearances." Mitchell stepped forward. The conditions Blackwood described, 3 years in temperatures below -60 degrees. Is that really possible for humans to survive? Sarah was quiet for a moment, then gave them a glimpse of what her real experiences had been like. "Dr. Mitchell, your cold tolerance trial exposed me to -38 degrees for 20 minutes in a controlled environment with emergency extraction available if something went wrong. That was like a mild spring day compared to what winter nights are like when you're alone in the Arctic with no backup, no rescue possibility, and equipment that has to keep working no matter what the conditions are." The researchers absorbed this revelation in silence. They had been testing someone whose cold weather experience made their most extreme experimental protocols seem comfortable by comparison. "Why did you volunteer for our research?" Webb asked. "Because the work you're doing here could help develop better equipment and training for people who have to operate in extreme conditions. That's important work that could save lives." Sarah stood up and collected her jacket from the back of her chair. "Dr. Webb, should I still come in tomorrow for the gear testing trial?" Webb realized that having someone with Sarah's experience evaluate their experimental equipment could provide insights that no amount of laboratory testing could duplicate. "Yes, absolutely. Your feedback could be invaluable for improving the gear we're developing." As Sarah prepared to leave, she paused at the laboratory door. "Dr. Webb, the work you're doing here is more important than you probably realize. The better we understand how humans adapt to extreme conditions, the better we can prepare people for situations where their lives depend on that knowledge." After she left, the 3 researchers stood in their laboratory, trying to process what they'd learned about their volunteer work and the implications for their research program. "We just spent a week thinking we were testing someone with unusual cold tolerance," Webb said quietly. "Instead, we were working with someone who has more experience with extreme cold survival than probably anyone else in the civilian world. And we can't tell anyone about it," Morse added. "Which means," Mitchell concluded, "that we continue our research knowing that we have access to someone whose expertise could revolutionize our understanding of human survival capabilities. But we can't reveal how we know what we know." The revelation had changed everything and nothing. Sarah Chen would continue participating in their research under her cover identity, but now they understood that they were working with someone whose real experiences made their scientific experiments look like practice sessions for the actual challenges of surviving in the world's harshest environments. The gear testing trial proceeded the following morning with an entirely different atmosphere than anyone had anticipated. Sarah arrived at the institute at precisely 8 a.m., greeting the security guard with the same polite professionalism she'd maintained throughout her previous visits. But now the research team understood that her punctuality and attention to detail weren't just good manners. They were operational habits, developed during years of missions where small mistakes could mean death. Dr. Webb had spent most of the previous night reconsidering everything he thought he knew about cold weather research. His laboratory's most extreme testing protocols were designed to simulate conditions that challenged human survival capabilities. Sarah had lived and worked in environments that exceeded those parameters for months at a time, alone, with no possibility of rescue if equipment failed or conditions deteriorated beyond manageable levels. "Good morning, Dr. Webb," Sarah said as she entered the preparation area. "I understand today's trial involves evaluating experimental cold weather gear." "Yes. We're testing a new insulation system designed for extreme environment operations. The manufacturer claims it can maintain core body temperature in conditions down to -50 degrees Fahrenheit." Sarah examined the gear laid out on the preparation table with the kind of careful attention that professionals gave to equipment their lives might depend on. The system consisted of a base layer, insulating middle layer, and outer shell, all incorporating advanced materials and design features that represented years of development work. "What kind of field testing has this system received?" she asked. Dr. Mitchell consulted his research notes. "Laboratory testing under controlled conditions, computer modeling of thermal efficiency, and limited field trials with volunteers in Alaska and northern Canada." "How limited?" "Exposure duration of 2 to 4 hours and temperatures ranging from -20 to -35 degrees. Sarah nodded, understanding immediately that the gear's real-world performance remained largely unknown. "What do you need me to evaluate?" "Thermal efficiency, mobility, durability, and comfort factors during extended cold exposure. We're planning a 6-hour trial with progressive temperature reduction to establish the system's operational limits." As Sarah began changing into the experimental gear, Webb noticed details about her physical condition that he'd missed during their previous interactions. Faint scars on her hands and forearms that suggested exposure to extreme conditions over extended periods. Muscle definition that came from functional strength rather than recreational fitness. Most significantly, calluses and skin texture that indicated prolonged exposure to harsh environments. "The base layer feels well designed," Sarah commented as she put on the first component. "Good moisture-wicking properties, and the seam placement won't create pressure points during extended wear." Dr. Morse monitored the physiological sensors as Sarah completed her gear preparation. Heart rate 58 beats per minute, core temperature normal, all monitoring systems functioning properly. The experimental insulation system transformed Sarah's appearance from civilian contractor to someone who looked ready for serious Arctic operations. The gear's design emphasized functionality over aesthetics, with features that addressed the practical requirements of people who worked in extreme conditions as a matter of survival rather than recreation. "Dr. Webb," Sarah said as she tested the gear's range of motion, "this system is designed for operational use, not recreational activities." "What makes you say that?" "The pocket placement, the way the hood integrates with the shell layer, the reinforcement at stress points. This gear is intended for people who need to perform complex tasks while wearing it, not just stay warm while stationary." Webb realized that Sarah's assessment was identifying design features that the manufacturers had developed for military and professional applications. Her expertise was revealing capabilities that wouldn't be apparent to researchers who lacked experience with operational cold weather gear. The testing chamber had been modified for the extended trial, with environmental controls capable of maintaining stable temperatures for the full 6-hour duration. Sarah entered the chamber with the same calm confidence she demonstrated during her initial cold tolerance trial, but now the research team understood that this environment was familiar territory for her. "Beginning initial temperature phase," Morse announced, -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Sarah moved through a series of predetermined tasks designed to evaluate the gear's performance during typical cold weather activities. Fine motor skills tests using specialized tools, gross motor activities that simulated equipment maintenance, cognitive challenges that measured mental function during cold stress. "Gear performance is excellent at this temperature," Sarah reported through the communication system. "No thermal bridging. Good dexterity preservation. Minimal bulk interfering with movement." Webb watched her performance on multiple monitoring screens, observing someone who was evaluating experimental equipment with the expertise of someone whose life had depended on similar gear working properly under far worse conditions. The temperature is now minus 25 degrees, Morse announced. Most volunteers at this temperature showed measurable performance degradation, even with high-quality cold-weather gear. Sarah continued her evaluation tasks with undiminished efficiency, providing detailed feedback about the system's thermal properties, ergonomic features, and functional limitations. Insulation systems maintain thermal efficiency, she reported. Some restriction in shoulder mobility when reaching overhead, but acceptable for most operational requirements. Mitchell leaned toward Webb and spoke quietly. She's not just testing this gear. She's conducting a professional equipment evaluation that's more thorough than anything we've documented before. Temperature minus 40 degrees, Morse announced. At this point, the experimental gear was operating at the edge of its design parameters. Previous testing had suggested that thermal efficiency would begin degrading significantly, requiring increased metabolic heat production to maintain core body temperature. Sarah's physiological responses remained stable, heart rate 62 beats per minute, core temperature normal, respiratory function optimal, but her feedback about the gear's performance became more detailed and technically specific. Thermal bridging is beginning to occur at the wrist seals, she reported. Insulation compression affects efficiency in high-contact areas. Moisture management is still adequate but approaching saturation limits. Webb realized that Sarah was identifying performance degradation before their monitoring equipment could detect it. Her experience with extreme cold exposure allowed her to recognize subtle changes in thermal efficiency that instruments might miss until conditions became dangerous. Dr. Webb, Sarah's voice came through the communication system. I recommend we extend this temperature phase. The gear is performing well, but I want to evaluate its stability over time at this operational limit. How long do you want to continue at minus 40 degrees? Another 90 minutes should provide adequate data about thermal performance degradation over extended exposure. Mitchell checked the safety protocols. Our standard procedures limit exposure at this temperature to 30 minutes maximum. I'm comfortable with extended exposure if your monitoring systems can track any significant changes in gear performance or physiological responses. Webb made a decision that reflected his new understanding of Sarah's capabilities. We'll extend the trial as you recommend, with continuous monitoring and immediate extraction if conditions become unsafe. Over the next 90 minutes, Sarah provided the most comprehensive evaluation of cold weather gear that the Institute had ever documented. Her feedback covered thermal efficiency patterns, durability factors under stress, functional limitations that affected operational capability, and design modifications that could improve performance. The gear is approaching its thermal limits, she reported after 85 minutes of minus 40-degree exposure, still functional, but efficiency is degrading in predictable patterns. Core insulation remains adequate, but extremity protection needs improvement for extended operations. When the extended temperature phase ended, Sarah had provided evaluation data that would influence the next generation of cold weather protection systems. Her assessment identified both the gear's capabilities and its limitations with the kind of precision that could only come from someone who understood the life-or-death importance of equipment reliability in extreme conditions. Temperature returned to minus 20 degrees for the cool-down phase, Morse announced. As environmental conditions improved, Sarah completed post-exposure evaluations that documented how the gear performed during temperature transitions. Her feedback addressed issues that laboratory testing typically missed, the practical considerations that affected real-world usability. When the trial ended after 6 hours, Sarah emerged from the chamber with comprehensive evaluation data that would revolutionize the Institute's understanding of cold weather gear performance. Her assessment covered technical specifications, operational limitations, user interface design, and recommendations for modifications that could improve effectiveness. Dr. Webb, she said, as she began removing the experimental gear, this system represents significant advancement in cold weather protection technology. With the modifications I've suggested, it could provide adequate protection for most operational requirements in extreme environments. Webb reviewed her evaluation notes, recognizing that Sarah had conducted professional-level equipment testing that exceeded anything his research program had previously achieved. Your feedback will be invaluable for the development team. I hope it helps create better protection for people who need to work in conditions where equipment failure isn't just inconvenient, it's fatal. As Sarah prepared to leave after completing her post-trial medical evaluation, Dr. Morse approached her with a question that had been weighing on the research team's minds since the previous day's revelations. "Sarah, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. I might not be able to answer." "The work you did, the Arctic Wolf missions, how did you survive conditions that extreme for so long?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "Dr. Morse, survival in extreme environments isn't just about having the right equipment or physical conditioning. It's about understanding that the environment isn't your enemy. It's just indifferent. The cold doesn't care if you live or die. It just exists. Once you accept that, you can focus on doing what needs to be done instead of fighting against conditions you can't change." Quote. She paused, then continued with words that revealed something about the psychological challenges of her operational experiences. The hardest part wasn't the cold or the isolation. It was knowing that if something went wrong, nobody would know what happened to you. Your job was to maintain equipment and collect data that might prevent terrible things from happening to people you'd never meet. That responsibility kept you focused when everything else tried to break you down. Webb realized that Sarah's evaluation of their experimental gear had been informed not just by technical expertise, but by understanding the human cost of equipment failure in situations where rescue wasn't possible. "The gear we tested today," she continued, "could mean the difference between life and death for someone working alone in conditions where there's no margin for error. That's why detailed evaluation matters. That's why getting the technical specifications right is more important than meeting development deadlines or budget constraints." After Sarah left the institute, the research team spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing her evaluation data and trying to process what they'd learned about equipment testing from someone with operational experience in the world's harshest environments. "Her assessment of that gear system is more comprehensive than anything we've documented in 18 months of research," Mitchell observed. "And now we understand why," Webb replied. "She's evaluated equipment under conditions where performance limitations had life or death consequences." Morse pulled up Sarah's physiological data from the trial. 6 hours of cold exposure, including 90 minutes at minus 40 degrees, and her responses remained within normal parameters throughout the entire trial. That's not just exceptional cold tolerance, that's professional-level adaptation to extreme conditions. Webb made notes about incorporating Sarah's evaluation methodologies into their standard research protocols. Her approach to equipment testing addressed practical considerations that laboratory procedures typically overlooked, providing insights that could improve the development of cold weather protection systems. But he also recognized that their research program had gained access to expertise that came with responsibilities they weren't entirely comfortable with. Sarah's participation in their trials was no longer just about scientific curiosity or equipment development. It was connected to classified operations that protected national security interests they couldn't fully understand. The consequences of the previous day's revelations were still unfolding, but one thing had become clear. Their research facility had become part of something much larger and more important than they'd originally understood. 2 weeks after the gear testing trial, Dr. Webb received an unexpected visitor that would fundamentally change his understanding of the research he'd been conducting and the woman who had become its most valuable contributor. Director Catherine Reynolds from the National Science Foundation arrived at the Anchorage Research Institute with a security clearance that allowed her to discuss aspects of their work that had previously been classified beyond their access level. "Dr. Webb," Reynolds said as they settled into his office, "I'm here to discuss the broader implications of your research program and how it connects to work being conducted at facilities you've never heard of." Webb had spent the past 2 weeks trying to process what he'd learned about Sarah Chen and her background. Now he was about to discover that his cold tolerance research was part of a much larger scientific effort that spanned multiple agencies and served purposes that extended far beyond academic curiosity. What kind of broader implications? Reynolds opened a briefcase and withdrew files that carried classification markings Webb had never seen before. "Your institute has been documenting human adaptation to extreme cold environments. What you haven't known is that similar research is being conducted at facilities that study adaptation to extreme heat, high altitude, underwater environments, and other conditions where human survival requires capabilities that go beyond normal physiological limits." She spread several photographs across Webb's desk, showing research facilities in locations he couldn't identify. Desert installations, mountain laboratories, underwater research stations, each equipped with environmental chambers and monitoring equipment that made his institute's capabilities look primitive by comparison. The volunteer you know as Sarah Chen represents the intersection of operational necessity and scientific advancement. Her participation in your trials has provided data that validates research being conducted at these other facilities. Quote, Webb studied the photographs, beginning to understand that his work was contributing to a comprehensive study of human environmental adaptation that had implications far beyond cold weather survival. How many people like Sarah are participating in this research? People with her specific background and operational experience? Very few. But the data from your trials with her has helped us understand what human beings are capable of achieving when properly trained and conditioned for extreme environment operations. Reynolds pulled out a chart showing physiological data from multiple research sites. Webb recognized some of the measurements from Sarah's trials, but the chart included data points that suggested human performance capabilities he hadn't known were possible. Dr. Webb, your research has documented someone who can maintain normal physiological function in conditions that would kill most people within minutes. Similar research at other facilities has documented individuals who can function normally at altitudes where oxygen levels are inadequate for human survival, in underwater environments where pressure would crush normal human physiology, and in desert conditions where heat would cause fatal hyperthermia in unprotected individuals. The implications hit Webb like a revelation. Sarah wasn't unique. She was part of a group of people who had been trained and conditioned to operate in environments that pushed human survival capabilities to their absolute limits. How many people have these kinds of capabilities? Fewer than 50 individuals worldwide, across all environmental specializations. They represent the outer edge of what human beings can achieve through training, conditioning, and operational experience. Reynolds showed him classified documentation about training programs that Webb had never imagined existed. Facilities where personnel spent years developing capabilities that allowed them to survive and function in conditions that would be lethal for normal humans. The work these individuals do maintains monitoring systems, collects intelligence, and conducts operations in places where conventional personnel couldn't survive long enough to complete their missions. Your research with Sarah has helped us understand the physiological mechanisms that make their work possible. Webb began to grasp the scope of what he'd become involved in. Dr. Reynolds, are you saying that my cold tolerance research is being used to develop training programs for other people? I'm saying that your documentation of Sarah's capabilities has provided scientific validation for training methods that previously existed without comprehensive physiological data. Your work helps us understand not just what these individuals can do, but how they're able to do it. She pulled out another file containing medical data that showed the long-term health effects of extreme environment conditioning. Dr. Webb, the people who do this work pay a physical price for their capabilities. The training and operational exposure required to develop their skills causes permanent changes in their physiology that affect their health for the rest of their lives. Webb studied the medical data, seeing evidence of physiological adaptations that came with costs he hadn't considered. Cardiovascular changes, metabolic alterations, and cellular modifications that enabled extreme environment survival but affected normal health parameters. Sarah's participation in your research isn't just contributing to scientific understanding. It's helping us develop better medical support for individuals who have sacrificed their long-term health to acquire capabilities that serve national security interests. The conversation was revealing ethical dimensions of his research that Webb hadn't fully understood. His scientific curiosity about human cold tolerance had connected him to programs where people deliberately subjected themselves to conditions that caused permanent physiological changes in service of national security objectives. What happens to people like Sarah when their operational careers end? Reynolds' expression became somber. They transition to civilian lives with medical conditions that most doctors don't understand, and capabilities that they can't discuss with anyone who lacks appropriate security clearances. Many struggle with isolation, health problems, and the challenge of finding meaningful work that utilizes their unique skills. Webb realized that Sarah's participation in his research represented more than scientific contribution. It was probably one of the few opportunities she had to use her expertise in a way that served constructive purposes while maintaining her cover identity. Dr. Reynolds, is that why Sarah volunteered for our trials, because it gives her a way to contribute to work that might help other people? Quote, that's exactly why she volunteered. Your research provides scientific documentation that could lead to better protective equipment, improved training methods, and enhanced medical support for people who operate in extreme environments. Reynolds closed the classified files and looked directly at Webb. Dr. Webb, I'm authorized to offer you expanded research opportunities that would give you access to data and resources that could revolutionize your understanding of human environmental adaptation. What kind of opportunities? Collaboration with the other research facilities I mentioned, access to volunteers with capabilities similar to Sarah's, funding for equipment and studies that would establish your institute as the leading center for extreme environment human factors research. Webb considered the offer, understanding that accepting would connect his work to classified programs that served purposes beyond academic research. What would be required? Enhanced security clearances for your team, expanded facility security, and research protocols that serve both scientific advancement and operational support for individuals who work in extreme environments. The offer represented everything Webb had hoped to achieve in his scientific career: access to resources, data, and research opportunities that could advance human understanding of environmental adaptation. But it also meant becoming part of a system that served national security interests through programs that required people to sacrifice their health and normal lives. I need time to consider this with my team. Of course. But Dr. Webb, I want you to understand something important. The work you've been doing with Sarah has already contributed to saving lives. The gear evaluation data she provided has influenced equipment modifications that will protect personnel operating in extreme conditions. The physiological data from her trials has validated training protocols that help people survive in environments where previous methods were inadequate. Reynolds gathered her files and prepared to leave. Your research matters, Dr. Webb. It serves purposes that go beyond scientific publication and academic recognition. It helps protect people who risk their lives to protect national security interests that most citizens never have to think about. Quote, after Reynolds left, Webb called Mitchell and Morse for a meeting to discuss the expanded research opportunities and their implications for their work and their relationship with Sarah. If we accept enhanced funding and expanded research parameters, Mitchell said, we become part of the intelligence community in ways that change everything about our work. Morse nodded. But we also gain access to research opportunities that could advance human understanding of environmental adaptation by decades. Webb considered both perspectives. There's another factor we need to consider. Our work with Sarah has shown us that there are people whose expertise and sacrifice serve purposes we hadn't fully understood. If expanding our research program helps support those individuals, that might be worth the complications of working within classified parameters. Over the following days, the research team discussed the offer extensively, weighing scientific opportunities against the ethical and practical implications of becoming part of classified research programs. Their decision was influenced by a conversation with Sarah during her next visit to the Institute. She arrived for what had been scheduled as a routine cognitive function evaluation, but the session evolved into a discussion about the broader purposes of their research. Sarah, Webb said, we've learned more about the context of our research and how it connects to work being done at other facilities. We're considering expanding our program to serve both scientific advancement and operational support for people with backgrounds similar to yours. Sarah's response revealed her perspective on the value of their work. Dr. Webb, the research you're conducting here could help develop better preparation methods for people who have to operate in extreme environments. That's important work that could prevent unnecessary suffering and death. But it would also mean our research becomes part of classified programs that serve national security interests. Most meaningful research serves multiple purposes. The question is whether those purposes align with your values and professional objectives. Morse leaned forward. Sarah, can you tell us whether expanding our research program would actually help people in situations like the ones you've experienced? Dr. Morse, the data you've collected from my trials has already influenced equipment modifications that will protect people operating in extreme conditions. Expanding your research could provide scientific support for training methods and medical protocols that save lives in situations where conventional approaches are inadequate. Sarah paused, then continued with words that revealed her understanding of the ethical complexities involved in their decision. The work people like me do requires accepting risks and making sacrifices that most people wouldn't choose. But that work protects things that matter: national security, public safety, and the freedom that allows scientists like you to conduct research that advances human knowledge. Webb realized that expanding their research program would create opportunities to contribute to work that served purposes beyond academic achievement. It would connect their scientific expertise to operational requirements that protected national interests through the sacrifice and expertise of individuals like Sarah. If we decide to expand our research program, Webb said, would you be willing to continue participating in our trials? Dr. Webb, I volunteered for your research because it serves constructive purposes that could help other people. If expanding your program enhances those benefits, I'd be honored to continue contributing to your work. The research team's decision to accept expanded funding and research opportunities was ultimately based on their understanding that their work could serve both scientific advancement and humanitarian purposes, helping develop better protection and support for individuals who risked their lives in service of national security objectives. Their collaboration with Sarah had taught them that scientific research could have implications and applications far beyond what they had originally imagined, and that the most meaningful research often served multiple purposes that aligned with both professional objectives and ethical responsibilities. 6 months after accepting the expanded research program, Dr. Webb stood in his transformed laboratory, watching Sarah Chen conduct her final evaluation of a new environmental monitoring system designed for Arctic operations. The Anchorage Research Institute had become the premier facility for extreme environment human factors research, but more importantly, it had become a place where the sacrifice and expertise of individuals like Sarah could contribute to protecting others who faced similar challenges. The monitoring system Sarah was testing represented the culmination of everything they'd learned about human adaptation to extreme conditions. It incorporated design modifications based on her feedback, physiological monitoring capabilities validated through her trials, and user interface features that address the practical requirements of people operating alone in conditions where equipment failure could mean death. System integration is excellent, Sarah reported through the communication link. The interface remains functional at -55 degrees, monitoring accuracy is maintained throughout the temperature range, and the emergency protocols are intuitive enough to use effectively under stress conditions. Webb watched her methodical evaluation with admiration that had grown over months of collaboration. Sarah's participation in their research had taught him that expertise often came quietly, without fanfare or self-promotion, carried by individuals whose contributions remained invisible to most of the world. Dr. Webb, Sarah continued, this system represents significant advancement in environmental monitoring technology. The modifications we've incorporated should provide reliable performance in operational conditions that would compromise earlier equipment designs. As the trial concluded, Webb reflected on how his understanding of human capability and scientific purpose had evolved through their work together. When Sarah had first volunteered for cold tolerance research, he had seen her as an interesting anomaly, someone with unusual physiological responses that might provide insights into human adaptation mechanisms. Now he understood that she represented something far more profound, the quiet heroism of individuals who developed extraordinary capabilities through training, sacrifice, and dedication to purposes that served others' safety and security. Sarah, Webb said as she completed her post-trial documentation, "This is your final evaluation as part of our research program. My cover assignment is ending," she confirmed. "I'll be transitioning to other work that continues to utilize my environmental adaptation skills." Webb felt the weight of losing someone whose expertise had revolutionized his research program and whose character had taught him important lessons about service, sacrifice, and the quiet strength that often went unrecognized in a world that celebrated louder forms of achievement. "Can you tell us anything about your next assignment?" "I can tell you that the work you've done here will contribute to better preparation and support for people who operate in extreme environments. The equipment modifications, training insights, and medical protocols we've developed together will help protect individuals who face conditions where conventional approaches are inadequate." Dr. Morse, who had become Sarah's closest collaborator during the gear testing protocols, stepped forward with a question that had been weighing on the entire research team. "Sarah, over the past 6 months, you've contributed to research that will benefit people for years to come. But we've also learned about the personal costs of developing the capabilities that made your contributions possible. How do you reconcile the sacrifices you've made with the knowledge that your work protects others?" Sarah considered the question with the thoughtful deliberation that characterized all her responses to complex issues. "Dr. Morse, everyone makes choices about how to use their capabilities and what purposes to serve with their lives. Some people choose careers that provide personal satisfaction or financial security. Others choose paths that contribute to knowledge, creativity, or community improvement." She paused, organizing her thoughts with the precision that had marked all their interactions. "I chose to develop capabilities that allow me to work in environments where conventional personnel couldn't survive, knowing that this work serves purposes that protect people and interests that matter for national security and public safety. But the personal costs, the isolation, the health effects, the inability to discuss your work with people who don't have security clearances, how do you manage those challenges? By focusing on the purpose rather than the cost. The work I do prevents things from happening that would cause far greater suffering than anything I've experienced personally. When you understand that your sacrifice serves that kind of purpose, the personal costs become acceptable. Dr. Mitchell, who had initially been most skeptical about the expanded research program, had become one of Sarah's strongest advocates after witnessing how her expertise contributed to developments that could save lives. Sarah, what advice would you give to other people who are considering careers that involve significant personal sacrifice in service of purposes larger than their individual interests? Understand clearly what you're choosing and why you're choosing it. Make sure the purposes align with your values and that you're prepared for the long-term implications of your decision. But also understand that meaningful work often requires accepting costs that less meaningful work doesn't demand. Sarah's words carried the authority of someone who had made difficult choices and lived with their consequences while maintaining commitment to the purposes those choices served. Dr. Mitchell, the most important thing is to remember that individual sacrifice only makes sense when it serves purposes that benefit others. The work I've done has meaning because it contributes to protecting people and interests that are more important than my personal comfort or convenience. As Sarah prepared to leave the Institute for the final time, Webb gathered his research team for a reflection on what they'd learned through their collaboration with someone whose expertise and character had transformed their understanding of human capability and scientific purpose. 6 months ago, we thought we were conducting routine research on human cold tolerance, Webb said. Instead, we discovered that we were working with someone whose capabilities challenged everything we thought we knew about human environmental adaptation. More importantly, Morse added, we learned that expertise often comes quietly, carried by individuals whose contributions remain invisible to most people but serve purposes that protect things we take for granted. Mitchell nodded. Sarah taught us that meaningful research often serves multiple purposes: scientific advancement, practical applications, and support for individuals who make sacrifices in service of broader objectives. Webb looked around the laboratory that had been transformed through their expanded research program, understanding that their work now contributed to purposes that extended far beyond academic achievement. The most important lesson Sarah taught us is that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they're properly trained, adequately supported, and motivated by purposes that serve others' welfare. Quote, as Sarah walked to her car for the final time, Webb realized that their collaboration had taught him fundamental truths about human nature, scientific purpose, and the quiet heroism that often went unrecognized in a world that celebrated more visible forms of achievement. Sarah Chin had demonstrated that the most dangerous people were often the ones who didn't need to advertise their capabilities, that the most meaningful work often remained invisible to public recognition, and that individual sacrifice could serve purposes that protected the safety and security that allowed others to live normal lives. Her participation in their research had provided scientific validation for human capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what most people thought possible, while her character had demonstrated the quiet strength and selfless dedication that made such capabilities meaningful rather than merely impressive. The expanded research program that grew from their collaboration would continue serving both scientific advancement and operational support for individuals who worked in extreme environments. The equipment modifications, training insights, and physiological data they had developed together would help protect people who faced conditions where conventional approaches were inadequate. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah's presence at the Institute had taught everyone who worked with her that expertise, dedication, and sacrifice often came without fanfare, carried by individuals whose contributions remained classified, unrecognized, and essential for protecting the things that mattered most. Webb understood that he would probably never see Sarah again, that her work would continue in classified programs that served national security interests he couldn't fully comprehend. But he also understood that their collaboration had contributed to research that would help protect individuals who made similar sacrifices in service of similar purposes. The lesson that would stay with him was that human beings were capable of remarkable things when they understood clearly what purposes their capabilities served, and why those purposes mattered enough to justify the personal costs of developing and maintaining exceptional abilities. Sarah Chen had demonstrated that the most profound form of heroism often remained invisible, carried by individuals who developed extraordinary capabilities not for personal recognition or reward, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing that their work contributed to protecting others who would never know their names or understand their sacrifices. In a world that celebrated loud achievement and visible success, Sarah represented the power of quiet competence, selfless dedication, and the understanding that meaningful work often required accepting costs that less meaningful pursuits didn't demand. Her story was a reminder that the most important contributions to human welfare often came from individuals who chose to develop capabilities that served purposes larger than their personal interests, who accepted isolation and sacrifice as necessary costs of work that protected things that mattered more than individual comfort or recognition. The research program that continued at the Anchorage Institute would serve both scientific advancement and operational support for individuals like Sarah, but it would also stand as testament to the understanding that human beings were capable of extraordinary things when they were motivated by purposes that served others' welfare and supported by scientific research that enhanced their capabilities while respecting their sacrifice. Webb's final entry in his research notes captured the essence of what their collaboration with Sarah had taught them. Human environmental adaptation represents not just physiological capability, but the intersection of scientific knowledge, individual dedication, and purposes that serve collective welfare. The most remarkable human achievements often remain invisible, carried by individuals whose expertise serves purposes that protect the safety and security that allow others to pursue normal lives without understanding the sacrifice required to maintain those conditions. Sarah Chen had shown them that the quiet ones often had the most important stories, that extraordinary capabilities often came without announcement or self-promotion, and that the most meaningful work often remained unrecognized by those who benefited from its results. Her legacy in their research program would continue protecting people who faced extreme environmental challenges, while her example would remind them that scientific work gained meaning through its service to purposes that extended beyond academic achievement to encompass the protection and welfare of individuals whose sacrifices made that work possible. The story of their collaboration would remain classified, but its lessons about human capability, scientific purpose, and quiet heroism would influence their approach to research for years to come, ensuring that their work continued serving both the advancement of knowledge and the support of individuals who made extraordinary sacrifices in service of extraordinary purposes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.